So hopefully you've had a few minutes now to kind of fill out this chart. Now this is my chart, okay? This is how I've charted my speaking anxiety. So let me explain to you kind of how my anxiety goes, and then maybe you can share your own charts with me. So generally speaking, a week before, the anxiety that I feel is fairly low, right? I have a whole week to prepare for this presentation. Oftentimes this is the time where I maybe procrastinate because I don't want to think about having to speak. But generally speaking, my anxiety is fairly low. So I have 0.02 over here, okay? Now moving a day before the speech, my anxiety definitely starts to rise, all right? The speech seems to be imminent, right? Hopefully by this point I've started to at least prepare for my presentation. But generally speaking, my anxiety starts to rise here. So about a day before, I'm at about a 0.6 in terms of the anxiety that I feel. All right, now moving to an hour before, my anxiety is still on the rise, okay? Speech is even more imminent than it was a day before, right? Maybe I'm even in class at this period if I'm presenting in class, right? My anxiety is definitely starting to peak, maybe at a 0.7, right? Now I feel that my anxiety peaks and I feel the most anxiety right before my speech. So 1 minute before, maybe I'm all the way up here at a 0.8, okay? So this is definitely the peak of my anxiety, and the reason that I think it's important to know when our anxiety peaks is because I can use a lot of the coping mechanisms related to anxiety to target that at its peak. All right, so I can use some of the coping strategies that we're going to talk about in the last section of the workshop at strategic moments throughout the process so that I can reduce my anxiety at those times. Okay? And generally speaking, 1 minute after the start of my speech, my anxiety starts to decline a little bit. Right? I start to feel maybe the speech wasn't as bad as I had anticipated it. You know, I'm starting to do well, I'm on a roll, so my anxiety definitely starts to decrease at that point. All right? So would anyone like to share their charts with me? Let me go ahead and ask you, Alyssa, when do you feel that your anxiety peaks in this process?
Well, mine would probably be 1 day before the speech because I kind of procrastinate a lot. So about 1 day before, I've really started worrying about it. But by the time I actually get in for the speech, it's already started to decline because I'm better prepared and I know what I'm doing.
All right. So then your peak is before mine. It's a little bit before mine. Okay, so that's good to know, right? How about you, Crystal?
I'd say 1 minute before.
Okay.
Because it's showtime and like I have to perform.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Yeah, so I think we're definitely on the same page there. I experience, my peak at the same moment, right? Okay, so what I wanted to note, though, in this chart is, generally speaking, throughout the process of preparing and delivering a speech, we experience 3 stages of speaking anxiety. All right, the first stage is the anticipation stage. Generally speaking, in this stage, our anxiety is lower than it is in other stages. We're anticipating that we're going to have to deliver a speech. So this kind of corresponds to the 1 week before, maybe even 1 day before, as we're anticipating having to engage in some type of public speaking or communication. Right, then we have the second stage, which we call the confrontation stage. This is the peak stage. This is where our anxiety rises to its peak. So for Alyssa, it's a day before. For Crystal and myself, it's a minute before. This is the confrontation stage, right, where we're confronting our anxiety head-on at its highest peak. Right? And then the third stage is what we call the drop-off stage. So generally speaking, most people feel a reduction in anxiety after they've started to present. So this is what we call the drop-off stage. And I know in my chart, for example, you saw a minute after my presentation, my anxiety had decreased significantly. So each individual is different, but generally speaking, we kind of go through these 3 stages at different points, but they are still present. Okay. So does anyone have any questions about the stages? Okay. So how many people do you think experience significant levels of public speaking anxiety? Do you think it's something that's kind of limited to yourself as an individual or to a small handful of people?
I would say most people probably do.
Okay, you think most people do? What about you, Crystal?
I guess some people.
Some people? All right. Well, according to James McCroskey, in fact, 90% of college students in the survey that he conducted experience moderate to high levels of anxiety. 90%. It's a really high percentage, right? So I think what this illustrates is the fact that all of us, or most of us, experience a significant degree of anxiety. So hopefully what we can take away from that is that we're not alone, right? Generally speaking, a lot of our classmates, a lot of our peers, a lot of our coworkers perhaps, are going through a lot of this, many of the same similar things that we are going through. Okay. So do we understand now not only what situations you experience the most anxiety in, but also where in the process you experience the most anxiety? Okay. So let's go ahead then and move on to the next page in our packet. All right. And now we're going to talk about manifestations of anxiety. So this is kind of relating back to that physical arousal in the chart that we showed. So we want to think, how specifically does anxiety manifest itself in us as an individual? And remember, generally speaking, anxiety manifests itself in one of two ways. There are physical dimensions of anxiety, so things that we experience in our body. Right? There are also mental dimensions of anxiety. Those are the things that are going through our head when we feel anxious. So if you look down on your sheet, I've started to list some physical dimensions of anxiety. And some of these are applicable to me as well. And I know the first one is an upset stomach. Okay? Oftentimes I get that feeling of butterflies in my stomach before I have to give a speech. I feel like I'm going to be sick. Okay? Trembling of the hands, weak knees. Sometimes I have a tendency to get a little bit shaky. It's a way the anxiety manifests itself in many individuals. Excessive perspiration is another one. Stuttering or fumbling for words, or speaking really quickly so that we can get through our presentation as fast as possible and go back and sit down at our seat. Sometimes we get a dry mouth or a feeling of a lump in our throat. Maybe we're not going to be even able to speak during the presentation. So can you think of any other ways perhaps that anxiety manifests itself physically in you as an individual? Maybe things that you have observed in others? So then what would be some ways that we experience physical anxiety? In addition to things that we've talked about thus far?
When your heartbeat speeds up.
Absolutely. Sometimes people feel like their heartbeat is going so fast it's going to pop right out of their chest, right? So that's definitely another physical manifestation.
I've heard of people getting itchy, so they stand up there and
Okay.
they scratch while they're presenting.
Absolutely.
Makes everybody uncomfortable.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and that would be an example of what we call an adapter, right? So adapters are gestures that we do that become distracting for our audience. So itching ourselves would be one of them. Clicking a pen or getting something in our hands that we're playing with would be another example of an adapter. So itchiness and adapters are definitely another physical manifestation of anxiety. Cool. So let's talk a little bit, though, about the mental dimension of anxiety. So some of the things that happen mentally, for me anyways, is perhaps a reduced ability to concentrate. Sometimes I have a really hard time focusing on my presentation because I'm focusing so heavily on my anxiety. All right. What about anticipations of catastrophic failure? What do you think I mean by that? Anticipating catastrophic failure.
We're going to fail the class or our speech or whatever it is we're doing.
Absolutely. So something happens that we just can't recover from. Whether it's a bad grade in the course, whether we get up here and we just can't even bring ourselves to start delivering our presentation. Oftentimes we anticipate failing catastrophically. Has that ever actually happened to you? Have you ever actually had a situation where you failed catastrophically during a speech?
No, I haven't.
No. Generally speaking, people don't experience that. So oftentimes we anticipate it, but it doesn't really pan out. That's important to keep in mind. Some other mental dimensions of anxiety would be maybe the desire to do anything to get out of speaking, right? I have to deliver a speech in class, I'm going to call out sick, There's another way, that we kind of think in our heads, how am I going to be able to get out of this situation? So can you think of any other mental dimensions of anxiety, or things perhaps that you're thinking about that causes you some anxiety? And again, we can kind of maybe relate this back to what we're talking about in the first section of our workshop, which is trait anxiety, right? That anxiety baggage, as it were, that we bring to presentation. Think of any other mental dimensions?
Maybe that we're going to forget the words, so
Absolutely.
we can't remember what it is that we wanted to say.
So maybe all of a sudden we're going to forget, the words of our speech, or even what our main points are, perhaps. Absolutely, that'd be a mental dimension. Okay. So now that we understand a little bit about the manifestations of anxiety, and we've discussed a little bit about how anxiety manifests itself in yourselves and in myself, let's go ahead on to the final section in our workshop, which is going to be talking about managing that anxiety that we do feel. So we began by understanding what is speaking anxiety, what are its different types, and where does it come from. Then we moved into discovering, where in the process do we start to feel the most anxiety as we're preparing for and then as we start delivering a presentation. We've also talked about physical and mental dimensions of anxiety. How do they manifest themselves in us as individuals? So now finally we want to talk about how we can then go about managing speaking anxiety. Before I begin this section, I want to emphasize that in no way should we or can we totally eliminate speech anxiety. or communication apprehension. It's something that all of us will feel. And indeed, if you remember from our chart, is not something that we should totally eliminate. Because a medium level of physical arousal, a medium level of anxiety, is going to motivate us to reach our optimal performance. Okay. So these strategies are designed to help rein in that speaking anxiety, to start to help to manage it, but not to eliminate it. Okay. So as we're looking through this sheet, all right, here are some tips, some strategies that can help you perhaps manage your anxiety. And also what I want to emphasize here is that some of these strategies will work for some people, some won't work for others. So it's really going to be kind of up to you to play around, to start to use these strategies and to see what works best for you as an individual.